Hello, welcome back, and happy Friday. Today, I want to finish our discussion of political sociology, and I want to do so by touching upon the core idea of the podcast that was assigned, this idea of money in politics. Now, I previewed this a little bit earlier by saying, is it really as simple as saying, donate money, get legislation that I want? Probably not. But at the same time, it's myopic to pretend that throwing some cash around in the direction of legislation has no effect at all. I mean, we're everybody we're human, and everybody who represents us is human. And money is a core motivating factor for just about all of us. Okay, so that's today's discussion: money and politics. All right, so I want to start by demonstrate by engaging with a couple of very famous quotes. The first is from a former congressperson, Jesse Unruh, Democrat from California, former Speaker of the House, actually. He said, "Money is the mother's milk of politics. Money is the thing that gives a life to politics." And then a second quote, Book of Timothy, chapter 6, verse 10. "Money is the root of all evil." So one quote here says that money is giving life, and the other says money is creating evil. Which one of these is more accurate based on what you have seen in the podcast, or what you have heard in the podcast? In my opinion, I generally fall under the first quote. Money is the mother's milk of politics. Money funds all sorts of things that we want, and it's what we do with it that truly matters. What is surprising to people? It's not surprising to anybody. Let me actually put it this way. I don't think it's surprising to anybody that money has an effect on politics. I really think it's myopic to pretend that there's no effect. But it might be equally myopic to assume that it's only used in a way that supports evil, polluting, racist legislation. It can be used for all those purposes, but it's about what we do with it within a democratic system. And as it turns out, the role of money is, I think, flowing in a different direction than many of us assume it to. It's mentioned in the podcast at length that it is not often lobbyists who are chasing down Congress people to try and give them a donation and then get an audience with a legislator or a lawmaker. It's often the other way around. Money has corrupted the process of getting elected in the first place. And that, to me, is the biggest thing to keep in mind. It does seem to me that the relationship between lobbyists and Congress people that I heard in that film, I guess I think the big enduring legacy of that is such that it changes the type of person who gets elected, and it changes the type of person who may choose to run for office. I think that certain social roles reward a certain type of personality. There's a certain type of person that becomes a good teacher. There's a certain type of person that becomes a good politician. And it seems to me that, from what I heard, the number one skill in becoming and remaining a congressperson is not attention to detail with the legislation. It's not coalition building within your own party or across the aisle. It seems to be an ability to raise money. And the type of person that's good at raising money is probably a little bit different from the type of person who's good at being a legislator in the strict sense of what that means in a day-to-day, in terms of what the book says our elected representatives are meant to do. And that, to me, is the big legacy of money in politics. It's not that it buys us legislation. What it does is it creates a body politic that itself is particularly predisposed to value money in the first place. And that's something I very much encourage you to keep in the back of your head every time you go to the ballot box on election day. Let's take a look at what money's actually meant in politics. The fact that Congress people, and especially is Congress people, have to spend so much time raising money and so much time knowing what to do with that money, that has created a bit of a feedback loop where now the person who wins the election is often, though not exclusively, the person who spends the most amount of money on the campaign. Okay, so if we're looking at this graph here, you can see that especially for the House, or excuse me, for the Senate, pardon me, especially for the Senate, the cost of the cost of winning an election for a senator has just gone way up, but also for the House as well. And it's in the House where I think that this is a little more of a problem, because how long does a Senate term last? Well, once you are elected, you are in the Senate for 6 years. And once, but Congress is reelected every other year. Your congressional term, if you win that election, lasts only 2 years. So they're always thinking about the next reelection in a way that the Senate or governors perhaps don't have to always be thinking of. That being said, the cost of winning a House election, like the House winner almost always outspends the House loser, and the Senate winner almost always outspends the Senate loser. And that's been rising over time, especially as it comes to the Senate. There's just fewer of those positions to go around. 2016 was a bit of a down year in the presidential spending, though. So 2016, there was down spending across the board, but I don't want that to distract from the overall the overall lesson of this slide here, which is in 2016, Hillary Clinton outspent President Trump and lost the election. You have to go pretty far back to find a situation in which that happened, in which the loser outspent the winner. Obama outspent Romney and won the election. Obama outspent McCain and won the election. George Bush narrowly outspent Kerry and narrowly won the election. George Bush outspent Gore and won the election. Bill Clinton outspent Dole and outspent George H.W. Bush and won both his elections. Bush outspent and beat Dukakis. Reagan outspent and defeated Mondale. You have to go pretty far back to find a situation, actually all the way back to 1964, in which Barry Goldwater appears to have outspent Lyndon Johnson and lost the election. So it's a pretty big gap. And it does seem, this is not to say you can buy elections, but again, it is myopic to pretend that this spending does not matter. Also, from 2000 onward, a very big increase, and this is not related to inflation. This is constant dollars, and it does seem that the amount that gets the amount that is being spent by both winning and losing presidential candidates has gone way, way up, even if 2016 was a bit of a down year on the Trump side of things. However, where's that money coming from? Most people actually give next to nothing. Somebody like Bernie Sanders is able to put together a very charming campaign saying that we have only small donors. And I have to admit, I respect him for that. 68% of all contributions to Congress come from 0.25% of the population, and everybody else gives the remaining 32%. Now, 32% is not chump change, but it's being absolutely dwarfed by what is being spent by a very, very narrow portion of the population. And that's worth keeping in mind, that the people giving the most money, it's a very small group of people that are spending this amount of money on campaigns. And again, the Congress people, as you heard in the podcast, and as I've been trying to emphasize today, it's Congress that's most vulnerable to this. The Congress people are the most afraid of their next reelection. There's a story in the podcast about the gentleman who won an election and took, I think, 5 days off from fundraising, and he's already fundraising for his next campaign. There's a story about the guy in Sacramento who was flooded with dark money on the opposition side and ended up losing his election, really in a very, very dishonest way. Where's this money coming from? It's coming from a very small portion of the population. And that does create, in my opinion, something of an anti-democratic force that can be very difficult to overcome. And in terms of who that 0.25% is, it says here that 0.26% of the people fund 68% of contributions to Congress. Think about what you would have to do. Like, if you had a fortune and you wanted to spend that on political and campaign contributions and political purposes, That's got to be something that's very, very important to you. And in fact, that's what we see. The top donors are outrageously polarized. So what you're seeing here is a polarization graph, and it is the political ideologies of the top 1,000 donors from the 2012 election. I was not able to find any data for the 2016 election. What you're seeing here is the money that's being spent. It's generally coming from very far left sources or very far right sources. There's no centrist or moderate out there that's spending this type of cash that is just dropping that type of bag upon a moderate centrist candidate. So if you want to know where the hell your Congress went, look no further than this graph here. Look no further than this. Why is Congress so gridlocked? Well, the most polarized people give the most amount of the highest donations, which then creates a selection bias in favor of the most ideologically extreme congressional candidates. And you end up with a Congress that is completely unable to function, that just is not able to do any type of functional work. And that's a problem to me. That's a problem. You're wondering, we treat it like it's a mystery. Like, why is Congress so polarized? Why can't Congress ever get anything done? Congress is further apart than it's ever been. And it's because the donors that funded those people are further apart than they have ever been. And that happened at a time in which money became much more important. Now, this may have changed a little bit as a result of political action committees. So we talked about Citizens United a bit in the podcast. Political Action Committee allows people to lobby without the negative publicity associated with lobbying. Everybody kind of thinks philosophically that lobbying is gross. But what if you didn't have to have your name actually attached to the check? So what a political action committee will do, and Citizens United has led to an absolute explosion of this. A political action committee collects donations from citizens and from corporations, and you can give unlimited money. There are limits on how much you can give to a congressperson. It's like $2,300, something stupid like that. But there's no limit on what you can give to a PAC. And once you do that, then the political action committee can distribute that money as they see fit. So it allows a very wealthy person to make donations to the people that they want without having their fingerprints without having their fingerprints on the deed, so to speak, without having their name on the check. So let's say you own a factory that is poisoning the Ohio River, for example. And you want to fund Congress people who are not going to pursue any type of legislation to crack down to support the EPA or crack down on pollution in public water sources. It's bad publicity if you say, yes, I want to protect my ability to pollute the fuck out of the Ohio River. But if you give it to a political action committee and then they give the money to said congressperson, now my hands are clean. You can benefit from what you hope is a legislative bump without suffering the negative publicity that is associated with trying to fund anti-social or anti-progressive legislation, okay? And Citizens United has obscured the source of donations, right? Like it was the Citizens United decision that led to this absolute explosion of dark money. Also, one of the side effects of economic inequality is that the super, super wealthy have a lot more money to throw around, just a lot more money to kind of splash the pot with. So what you're seeing here is in 2008, there was $69 million in dark money spent. And by 2012, after post-Citizens United, $310 million. I suspect that's going to go up and up and up. Donald Trump actually received quite a bit of dark money because a lot of people did not want to be seen. A lot of super wealthy people who really wanted their taxes cut wanted to not have their fingerprints on that. They didn't want to be seen funding a candidate who was quite, at least in my opinion, quite rightly viewed and portrayed as harboring very racist ideas and policies. But if I get my tax cut, maybe that's all I care about. And so there's been an explosion in this hidden type of money. And you heard about that in the podcast about this man out in Sacramento who was running a really nice campaign and just gets torpedoed through dark money. And there's nobody he can kind of go back at on that. Ends up losing the election as a result of that. Now, as for what that actually means in terms of policy adoption, it's complicated. You can't just buy legislation. This isn't Poland. But what you can do is create a situation in which financially the other side is not able to compete. And that is an anti-democratic force that is not looked at as anti-democratic because the Supreme Court protects the right of free speech and massive donations count as free speech. Lobbying does not necessarily guarantee victory. Let's take a look at the graphs here. The top graph is the resources mobilized for change. It's kind of a measure of how much more money was spent, like what was the difference in resources spent on policy change, that's on the x-axis, versus resources spent for the status quo, that's on the y-axis. So you see that bar in the middle that's going upwards from 0. Any dot that's above that means that status quo support was larger than policy change support, and anything below it, that means policy change support was larger. The money, there was more money spent on policy change than on supporting the status quo, and all of those are situations in which there was no policy change that occurred. So the status quo won out. And you can see things on both sides of it. Sometimes you spend more money and don't get your way. Sometimes you spend more money and do get your way. Same thing is observed on the bottom. Resources for policy change on the x-axis, resources supporting the status quo on the y-axis. And I can see sometimes this is where a policy change did occur. Sometimes, again, you spend money and don't get your way. Sometimes you spend money and you do get your way. But at the end of the day, throwing some cash around certainly doesn't hurt either. Economic elites have been able to put their support behind things with a much greater likelihood of success. So what you're seeing on the top here is the average citizen's preference. As the support among average citizens increases, what happens to the predicted probability of legislation adoption? When 0% of people support something, there's a 30% chance that it will happen. And when 100% of the people support something, there's about a 32 or 33% chance of something happening. So it almost doesn't matter at all. It's just a 1 in 3 chance that something is going to get passed anyway. When the economic elites support something, or when the economic elites have a 0% chance of supporting something, there's almost a 0% chance of that legislation passing. When 100% of them do, it's about a 60% chance of a predicted probability of adoption. So hey, it does not hurt at all to throw some cash around. Elites do not have a monopoly on this. Elites do not get to buy legislation. But again, it is immature and myopic to pretend that doesn't affect the makeup of your Congress and that doesn't affect the priorities of the people that are in charge of making legislation for the entire country. So what do we do in this type of circumstance? Because you and me, most of us are never going to make the amount of money that we would need to significantly influence super PACs and to be able to flood elections that we care about with dark money. So what do we do? Well, this is where the debate between representational politics and extra representational politics becomes really important. I'm always curious among my students, how many of you would agree with the following statement? It is your right, or excuse me, let me start over. It is your duty to vote. Almost everybody agrees with that philosophically. And I personally think anybody who wants to vote should absolutely vote. And I would never try to talk anybody out of voting. Like I would never, nobody tries to discourage people from voting unless they're actively trying to fix an election, unless you are the state Republican Party of North Carolina, then you try to do that. But nevertheless, it's a little bit bizarre to me, the level of vitriol that is directed by voters to the direction of non-voters. It's your duty to vote. Well, voting, the purpose of voting is to uphold a free society. So you should probably not be arguing that at all, right? You should probably not be arguing that it's anybody's duty to vote when the whole point of voting is to uphold freedom within the society. Your vote counts. Well, it is counted, usually. But even if you had voted illegally 100 times in the like in the closest Florida county in the 2000 election, the closest one in recent memory, you still wouldn't have swung the election. Like you would have had to vote 1,000 times to even swing a county, let alone something at the state level. But people are risking their lives in other countries to vote. Hey, that is brave and that is noble. But it's not exactly a smart decision. What do you want me to say about that? I find the reason to vote, and I will say I do vote, but the reason why I vote is not because I think it matters. The reason why I vote is not because I want to preserve my right to complain. I can do that anyway. The reason why I vote is because it's an important symbol of democratic participation. And in such a financially stratified society, in a place that's rife with so much economic inequality, I vote because symbolically, it's the only way to make my voice heard, even if that voice isn't very important, even if that voice ultimately doesn't matter, even if that voice cannot promise me my way on things, right? Democracy doesn't promise me my way. It just promises me I get a chance once every X number of years to say something about the situation. And so I think into a situation where it's harder and harder for the average person to make a difference, and to participate in representational politics, that's the type of situation where extra representational politics, things like protest movements, things like institutionalized social movement organizations like Greenpeace become very important to us. If normal people want to have a say in what their government does, we have to do that collectively. And that's why I vote, because a lot of people like me are voting, like a lot of people who are citizens of this country are voting. And I do it essentially just to have something in common with those people. I do it essentially just to have something in common and to feel like I'm participating in something related to my society. But I'm beginning to feel I might be better served putting time, money, and energy behind the social movements that seem to align the most with what I would like to see happen. And maybe all that effort goes for nothing. It's the way it goes sometimes, but maybe it doesn't. So I encourage you, don't overstate the value of your vote, but also don't feel like everything is hopeless either. Trust in yourself, trust in your institutions, and trust in extra representational institutions, because history proves they can influence the political system. I wish you guys a very great, a wonderful weekend. I'll be back next week talking about something else, and you guys take care of yourselves. Stay well, stay healthy. Bye.